The United Nations gave its starkest warning yet about the challenges facing the fight against climate change, and in particular, efforts to get to net zero on emissions. One of the solutions that's being put forward by businesses and policymakers is hydrogen as an alternative and clean source of fuel. But how real is the opportunity? How much is it hype? You're listening to the Business Extra podcast coming from the National in Abu Dhabi. I'm Mustafa Alrawi, Assistant Editor-in-Chief. If you like this show, please do subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your content. With me is Kelsey Warner, National's Future Editor. Hi, Kelsey.
Hey, Mustafa.
Very much the future we're talking about now, the future of energy, but within the context of the really alarmist news coming out of the UN, a much awaited report on where we stand on climate change, and essentially that the emissions have caused global warming to such an extent that we are going to most likely miss our objectives, the global objectives, and there really is no more time now to really tackle human-made emissions.
A human-made disaster. And I would argue that not alarmist, but maybe one of the first realistic reports that actually lays out granular data as to what all is happening and ties it to man-made, destruction of the earth. So I think we're in a new framing of this crisis, and part of understanding it is understanding hydrogen, which the UN has said is our best hope of replacing, fossil fuels wholesale, is tapping into the hydrogen molecule, which for the past several decades has faced many technical hurdles. But, you'll see it in headlines, but kind of digging into what it is, how does it work, and how might it help? What role does it have to play in addressing this issue? We talked to one of the region's most active players, the CEO of Acwa Power, Paddy Padmanathan. Here that is.
Paddy, thanks so much for being with us today, and particularly talking about this topic that I know you're kind of very much involved in day to day, which is the hydrogen opportunity. But for most people out there, they might not be aware that that the reality of the hydrogen economy or the hydrogen energy opportunity is there. Maybe it would be helpful if you could kind of frame that for us from your point of view.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Delighted to join you. Yes, I'd very much like to explain why it's truly a fantastic opportunity, particularly at the right time, as we now recognize the urgent need to reduce greenhouse gases as fast as possible. So the opportunity around hydrogen is very straightforward. I think we all know that something over 50 gigatons of emissions being pumped out into the atmosphere every year through a variety of human endeavor. There's an enormous amount of focus on renewable energy, quite rightly so. But the issue around renewable energy is that that's about electrification, and something like 2025, just under 25% of emissions come from electricity generation. So even when we get to the point where we are able to completely go to renewable energy for electricity generation, we're only going to be dealing with something like just over 25% by then of emissions. The rest of the emissions are coming from transportation, industrial, manufacturing, and agriculture. That's where the bulk of it is. So transportation, starting to deal with it in the form of, again, electric vehicles and so on and so forth. And the world is also moving more and more towards consuming electricity. So by 2050, if we kind of look forward, it's conceivable that electricity would probably account for well over 50% of energy we consume. So that's all good news for renewable energy. But what about the rest? And the challenge with the rest, heavy transportation, long distance transportation, aviation, and industry like steel, aluminum, wood, the whole range of industries. Now, the industrial processes require a reactive agent as much as very high temperatures. The exciting thing about hydrogen is that hydrogen is something that actually can be used as a reactive agent in order to, say, reduce iron ore to steel. It can be used for very high temperatures. So it is a fantastic molecule that's very powerful. Now, already the world uses something like 70 million tons of hydrogen a year. And that's produced by burning fossil fuel. And that is used mainly for fertilizer production as well as chemical industries predominantly. Now, so that doesn't help if we're going to burn fossil fuels. But there is a way to produce hydrogen, which we all are very familiar with. We've sort of gone to do some physics lessons. If by splitting the water molecule, which is H2O, we are able to liberate hydrogen and oxygen. And to do that using a process by the name of electrolysis, sticking electricity, 2 electrodes into a beaker of water, you can liberate these. So it is highly energy intensive in that it uses electricity, but we can split the hydrogen. Now, if we can produce that electricity with renewable energy, then we really have now, all of a sudden, a new way of making hydrogen that is entirely green, in inverted commas, renewable energy based. If we can do that at scale, then we can use that hydrogen for all these other industrial processes. And in fact, even it is plausible to remove carbon dioxide from systems or processes, or even from direct air, and combine it with this hydrogen to produce synthetic fuel, which can then work with aircrafts and engines and so on. So that is why hydrogen has become such a sought-after molecule now, particularly as we are able to start contemplate producing that hydrogen with renewable energy.
Paddy, thank you for that lesson. To your point, producing hydrogen is massively energy intensive. But we're sitting here today talking about its possibilities. What hurdles have been addressed? What hurdles still remain for us to see the hydrogen molecule begin to replace the carbon molecule at wide scale?
So the first hurdle, good question. The first hurdle that has been overcome is that, as you said, it's an energy intensive process. Something like 60+% of the cost of producing green hydrogen is the cost of electricity. We are now able, in certain geographies across the world, able to produce electricity using renewable energy very cost competitively. Just to give kind of global order of magnitude numbers, using fossil fuels, we were generating electricity at something like, on average, 7-8 cents per kilowatt hour. We are now able, and that's without even accounting for the carbon emission costs and all the rest of it, or abatement costs. We are now able to produce in certain geographies, not right across the world, but certain geographies like in the GCC, for example, and in countries like Chile and in Australia, we are able to produce at 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So that hurdle has been already surmounted. So we are able to produce, and that is what is really starting to make it exciting, that we probably can, not probably, it's looking very certain, and we are already working on our first project, able to produce at a much lower cost, renewable energy-based green hydrogen that within the next 5 to 10 years, as we start to produce more of it at scale and reduce the cost of other components that are involved in this process, we should be able to bring it down to a level that really becomes cost competitive for pretty much everything.
So Paddy, because Acwa Power, you've been involved in renewables for some time in this region, a lot of projects, and if we use the differing examples, so we have what you're talking about, sort of green hydrogen, which is the ideal, comes from renewable energy, helps us produce the hydrogen that can then be used in cars, in industry, and elsewhere as a fuel source, a clean fuel source. Then we have what the other side, which is sort of the blue hydrogen, which is produced from, say, natural gas, creating ammonia, which is easily transportable. That is, for example, right now being shipped to Japan from Abu Dhabi, for example. There are deals on that, and they use that ammonia as a fuel source. The CO2 has been removed from it. But as you said, it's starting from the point of fossil fuels, which isn't necessarily the cleanest way to go forward. But if we can address the excitement, because I think this is what we want to understand. We want to understand the difference between hype and reality. And if I can take you back to the early days or the early-ish days of renewable energy, say 2007, 2008, 2009, there was a lot of hype around solar, wind, solar in particular, and it was going to be paid for by subsidies. So you look at Europe, for example, in Germany, government subsidies was paying for the proliferation of solar. Then the subsidies were pulled, the market collapsed. But then we saw the emergence of sort of industrial scale solar, for example, like you said, in the GCC and the UAE, and that's being paid for at the kind of industrial level by companies, by governments. So who is going to pay for the development of hydrogen? You know, who's on the hook for that? Who's going to come in and say, I'm going to make this investment now urgently to meet the sort of wider climate change urgency, the idea that we can reduce emissions this way, that we can help, contain global warming as a result? I mean, do you see this as real, or is the excitement a little bit overdone? Given the way you're speaking, it sounds like we still might have to wait a decade or more for this to materialize in terms of green hydrogen.
So a couple of things just to start with, though. So blue hydrogen, by the way, is essentially hydrogen made out of the same sort of old process that produces gray hydrogen, steam methane reforming process, burning natural gas, but taking the carbon that is produced in the process out of the system and sequestrating it. And indeed, one of the challenges today, so we have solved, in my view, we are very far advanced in solving the problem of producing green hydrogen cost effectively. In this first project that we are already involved with, which most likely will end up being first project at scale that's going to be done in the world to produce 650 tons per day of green hydrogen at NEOM, in partnership that we are doing with Air Products and NEOM, we can already see how quickly we can bring the cost down because of the fact that we are able to generate renewable energy so competitively. However, the challenge with hydrogen is so far that 70 million tons of hydrogen that is produced in the world every year, is produced using, is used largely at the site where it is produced. So we haven't really got around to moving hydrogen long distance somewhere, from one point of production to some other point of use, because it is a challenging molecule to move around. So that has been a problem that we didn't need to deal with, because if we need it in an industrial process or chemical process, we produced it there and then by moving the gas around and burning it at that point. Whereas now, if we move towards a true sort of global scale hydrogen economy, the challenge that we're going to have to overcome, and that we haven't overcome yet, is how we move it around. Okay, we have come up with an intermediate step. We're able to convert the hydrogen to ammonia. Whether it is green, blue, or gray, doesn't really matter. We can convert it to ammonia and move liquid ammonia around very effectively. But the problem then is, of course, by the time we then move the liquid ammonia to some other point of use and then re-crack it back to hydrogen, through this sort of process, we are losing efficiency, so unnecessarily adding cost. So that's a challenge that we're going to overcome over the next decade as we start to produce green hydrogen at scale fairly cost competitively. Now, back to the question of who is going to pay for it, or who is going to help subsidize it. Let's understand one thing very quickly. You're absolutely right. Renewable energy, solar energy and wind were made cost competitive by a few countries like, leadership to Germany or credit to Germany, and then Spain. And a few other countries starting to subsidize, offer big subsidies that then brought in more innovation, more competitive tension, more participants, kept reducing the cost. And as we deployed more and more, we reduced the cost to the point where for the last several years, right across the world, nobody needs subsidy for renewable energy anymore. I mean, Acwa Power, we have contracts to deliver photovoltaic energy at scale with zero subsidy in a country like Ethiopia at 2.6 cents per kilowatt hour. Forget it. So we don't need subsidies for renewable energy anymore. Now, and that took quite a while, that sort of subsidy phase for renewable energy in earnest took probably over a decade. My personal belief is I don't think we would need that kind of a scale and that kind of a time period for hydrogen. But let's go back to, so at a very, very high level, as I said, using the steam methane reforming process and today's sort of cost of energy, cost of oil and gas, we can do gray hydrogen is produced at $1.20, $1 to $1.20, that kind of a number per kilogram. Blue hydrogen, so by the time you then take the carbon out, that process, blue hydrogen will become more like, this is at the point of production, by the way, you haven't started to ship it. It would probably be about $1.75, that kind of a number. Green hydrogen today, because it's not produced at scale, very small electrolyzers, not many people are involved in it, it's $5, $6, okay, plus. But
is that per ton? When you're
all
saying
per kilogram,
per kilogram,
all per kilogram, all per kilogram. So so I'm giving you a relative scale. However, the first sort of project at scale for green hydrogen is going to bring half that number, no question. Okay, so from 6, we're going to come down to well below 3 at the point of production. Let's get it right. But it's still 3 times more expensive than gray hydrogen, right? Or another, nearly double the price of blue hydrogen. But that's the first project at scale. The second project at scale will bring it down even further. Okay, but we are still at the point of production. Now, the point of use is all around the world. So we now still have to. So the first project, we are having to convert it to liquid ammonia, ship it. In this instance, it's fairly public knowledge, the Air Products intention, who is the off-taker. Their intention is to take it to the Far East and recrack it and put it into use in transportation via hydrogen fuel cells. So lots of costs will get added by the time it gets to that end. Now, so today, Korea, Japan, and some parts, Los Angeles, San Francisco, the West Coast of the United States is offering subsidies that are sufficient to make it cost competitive in order to be able to go through this process and deliver hydrogen fuel cells. But for me, that's just a starter. And thank you very much to those countries and those regions that is allowing us to start to deploy hydrogen at scale and start the process of reducing cost. But, different people have got different sort of views, but my personal view is that it wouldn't take as long as it did take in the case of renewable energy in order to get hydrogen down to a standalone cost competitive level without subsidy. And certainly, my personal view is not going to take 10 years. It's going to be much faster than that. Particularly if more people can jump into the sector and start producing more and more at scale, because we need to bring the cost of electrolyzer down. The renewable is already down. Electrolyzer needs to come. The cost of electrolyzer needs to come down. But then pretty much you are able to produce hydrogen at the point of production fairly competitively. Now then we need to find ways of moving that hydrogen more cost effectively. Now, again, there's progress being made there. Snam in Italy, one of the largest pipeline operators in the European sector, have started to inject hydrogen into their pipeline system at varying levels. They've already done it at 20% without any impact. They're able to blend it with natural gas and take it out on the other side and separate it and deliver it as green hydrogen. They are intent on increasing those contents to see how far they can push that up before having to completely redesign the pipeline system. There is already the first hydrogen ship under construction in the Far East to look at moving hydrogen over long distance. So, look, there's a lot of work. We just need to do it faster, and we need to do it within the decade rather than take the whole decade doing it.
I mean, we simply do not have time. The race to 2050 and net zero, what you're describing is really first projects. What I'm understanding from you is this is going to reach a price tipping point much faster than solar and wind power did. But can this be achieved in the next 3 decades, what you're talking about, the kind of scale, the exporting capacity, the change to infrastructure? These are very promising first major industry scale projects, but what is your sense on this kind of race to 2050 and this stark warning that we got this week from the UN?
Look, I really, really, really think it is really possible because we saw what happened in renewable energy. So why no one predicted that renewable energy will get down to this level so fast. And we are now starting to deploy renewable energy projects at really scale. So it was only 5 years ago, we were talking about a 100 megawatt project as a big deal. 100 megawatt solar, 200 megawatt solar was a big deal. Today, every other project is 2,000 megawatts, 3,000 megawatts. Solar project, 2,000 megawatt wind farm. So we've really immediately moved across because it's all become cost competitive and we are able to produce it at scale. Absolutely, I can see the trajectory as to how hydrogen can get there fairly quickly to cost competitiveness, and then we can start to deploy it fairly fast. Look, it's not a matter of are we going to be able to do it? We're going to have to do it. There is no other choice. And right now, for all that hard to abate, things like industrial processes, things like fertilizer making, chemicals, many manufacturing and long distance transportation, heavy transportation. There is no other solution. It's really, for the moment anyway. Now, we're going to keep trying and we're going to keep inventing new stuff, but that obviously is going to have even a longer trajectory of time, right? So immediately, hydrogen is the solution. And all I am saying is, and what I'm seeing, I'm happy to see, so many people jump into it and start to recognize it. I think even if 10% of all the projects that have been announced, and we keep a track of these projects out of interest, we will get hydrogen deployed faster than people believe. It's just that now is the time for action and people need to jump in and with conviction and just race forward.
That was Paddy Padmanathan, the CEO of Acwa Power. That's it for today. Kelsey, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
All that remains to thank our production team, Lean Al Faisal, Arthur Edison, and Aisha Khan, and you all for listening. Do join us again next time.